Stencils and spray paint are a match made in heaven. There's a lot of different sprays on the market these days, and I'm going to show you a few that I utilize in my work, and maybe you'll find that they work for you as well. This is one of our all-over pattern stencils, and I'm going to lay it on top of just a sheet of black text weight paper. Spray paint, and this is one that's a low VOC, so there's not a lot of smell. However, if you are using spray paint, it is really best to do it out of doors. You have to shake it up, follow the instructions on the can. And it is just that easy, seriously. You gotta love it. I even like how it kind of bled out there. I didn't do that on purpose, but it just looks cool. Another kind of spray paint, and I'm going to use these all together. These are some of the craft spray paints that are on the market these days. This one, these two are both Ranger products, and this is by Aladdin. This is a gloss spray by Dina Wakley. Has a ball in it, so that always is your clue that you need to shake it up really well. This is a distress spray stain. It's the Tim Holtz Distress line, and this one by Aladdin is a Seth After. So what I'm gonna do is lay the stencil across, and I'm just gonna use all three of these sprays so you can get an idea of what each would look like. This is the gloss spray. This is the Distress. And here's the Seth After, the Aladdin Eye Zinc. Helps if you actually get it on the stencil. Another thing you can do with sprays, I'm gonna pull this up, show you the results. I was a little overzealous there, but I think you still get the idea. I'm gonna flip this down, and I'm just going to put a piece of paper on top to kind of press it down. That actually looks sort of cool right there. And there, you get a 2-for-1, right? Sprays, you gotta love them. When most people think of stencils, the first thing that comes to mind is paint, because that's what we use with stencils so frequently. I have a couple different kinds of paint here, and I'm going to show you how stencils can be used, with each thickness of paint, because it's a little bit different depending on the type of paint you have. I will say one thing: keep it dry, and you need less paint than you think. So this is a heavy body paint, and this would be the easiest paint to stencil with, because look how thick it is. So to keep it dry is going to be pretty easy right from the start. The best way to stencil with paint, I think, is to use a sponge. Some people like brushes, but not me. I like the sponge, and I put some paint on and then I pounce it off like I'm doing right here. So with that approach, I can get a lot of detail. Pounce up and down. Going like this is only going to tend to make the paint go underneath the stencil. So if you stay up and down, you can't get into too much trouble, and you'll get a nice crisp result. Let's say you want to do some words, because there's a lot of great word stencils out there. Same deal. Get it on your sponge, up and down, up and down. If you are a little hesitant, you can always use some tape to tape your stencil down. And there are also spray adhesives that work for keeping the stencil in place. I tend to just wing it, but it's all a matter of personal preference. So that was a heavy body paint. Now let's take a look at what is called a fluid acrylic. You can hear when you shake it that it's much more liquid. And it looks more liquid when it comes out of the container. Fluid acrylics might seem tricky, not so much. Same thing, pounce up and down. And there you go. Here's another paint that is a chalk finish acrylic. It's kind of maybe not as thick as the heavy body and not as thin as the fluid, kind of in between. Once again, I do exactly the same technique. I pounce up and down. And that is the key. It's just as easy as that. I bet you never thought of stenciling with watercolor, did you? Well, I am going to show you how that might work. I have previously wet down these watercolor paints, and I'm going to use this stencil for the demo. I'm going to grab a little bit of the watercolor. It's pretty wet on there. I'm going to just pounce to make sure it's distributed over that sponge well. Okay? And again, up and down, up and down. Look how fluid it is and how wet it is. But you can get a pretty decent result with watercolor. It might be surprising. Let's see it with a more detailed stencil. Little less paint this time and a better result. So that is the key. Use a sponge, the densest sponge you can find. These are craft sponges available in most of the big box stores, and this is a sponge that is actually, I believe, made to use with fabric, but I like it rather a lot. I think a dense sponge works the best. And keep your paint as dry as you can, and you will achieve success with paints and stencils. Remember making rubbings when you were a child? I used to love that. Just pulling different texture using my crayons and a piece of paper and pulling different textures off of interesting items. Well, I still like doing that. And stencils really enable us to get some cool results with rubbings. This would not be a great choice for a stencil or a mask that's going to rub well, mainly because it's got such big open spaces and you don't get much bang for your buck. Stencils that work great for this are something like this that has a real tight design, or I think this one's going to be pretty cool too. As far as what to use for rubbings, well, this is a rubbing wax that is made for rubbing textures off of gravestones, and this works great. In addition, just regular old crayons work. Now, these might not look like regular crayons to you. That's because they're made for children and they're made out of soy wax. I like them because they fit in my hand easier for rubbing, and so I keep them on hand just for that. Let's try and see how they look. So it is just like you remember when you were a kid. Put the stencil down, put the tissue over the top, any kind of tissue, and then just rub the crown across it. There's one, here's one. Ooh, that one's really sweet. And then here's our gravestone. Rubbing. This is really hard, almost like hockey puck hard. That's the biggest difference. But you can see how you get such a great result. Isn't that pretty? Let's rub an image of the world here. Ooh, look at this. This looks pretty cool. You can also use other thin sheets of paper. Just try whatever you have on hand and see what works. I think rubbings are great to keep on hand, to put in your journal pages and make cards with, or who knows what you might do with them. They're just a lot of fun. Now I'm kind of tempted by this guy sitting out here, so I gotta just see if it's possible to do a rubbing of this. Oh, and it sure is. If you keep it flat keep it flat and just go in one direction. It's actually a lot more interesting than I imagined. Go forth and rub. Did you know you could use stencils for sanding? Sounds a little weird, doesn't it? Well, it's kind of like the cousin to rubbing. So all you do is, what I do is I use like interior decor magazines, or this is from a catalog, and I just pull out a page that's pretty dark because this is something where you want a lot of contrast. I use a stencil that has what I call a tight design, which means the spaces are close together. I'll show you both of these, how they work. Let's put this one underneath first. Put the stencil down, magazine page on top. Here's a piece of sandpaper, fairly fine. And here's one of those little nail sanding blocks like you get when you have a manicure. And check this out. I mean, it's just a little bit of magic right there. Isn't that amazing? So for me, I love to put these in journal pages, and it's that kind of thing where nobody can ever figure out how you did it, right? Look at this. So whether you use, the block or the sandpaper, you can always get cool results. I tend to use a finer sandpaper. If you use something more rough, you might blow through the magazine page, but trust me, that's cool as well. Enjoy. You can trace inside of a stencil with either a thin line marker, a pencil, or if you're really good with a paintbrush, you could probably do it with that too. So I'm just going to give you an idea how I might use this in a journal page. If we're looking at these little leaves down here, they're super easy to trace because it's an easy open pattern. You could trace it like that. You could go back, color it in with a pencil. You could doodle within it or anything. You can spritz the end of this, and this is an Inktense pencil. It kind of turns into an ink, and you can easily color that in to get a little bit of extra interest there. If you wanted to put one of these little ones, I'm going to try to do it without getting on that wet part. And remember, the tip of this is already wet, so I'm already getting a little bit of a blurred line, which I think is kind of nice. So many different ways to address stencils, but let's say you're in the mood to doodle and you don't feel like drawing anything. Well, use a stencil, trace within it, and then go back and doodle. Easy peasy. One thing I enjoy doing with stencils is what I call a subtractive technique. And this is where we actually pull away rather than putting down. And I'm going to show you how. It's one of those techniques that people can often really not figure out what you've done, right? So I'm starting with just any old paper that I have gessoed and allowed to dry. So that's what I'm applying this on, and you can use any paints for this. I've made it work with distress crayons, with scribble sticks, with all sorts of things. I don't believe this is gonna work with watercolor, but any of your acrylic paints, this would work great. I'm just using a couple different colors because I thought it might be pretty. So I'm putting the paint down, and now I want to do my subtractive technique before the paint dries, okay? So here's a stencil. I'm gonna lay it down on top of there, and I've got a baby wipe here. You could use probably a damp rag or whatever you have, and just kind of pull, pounce, pull. I'm sort of pressing down but pulling up at the same time to move the paint around. What I'm doing is the stencil smushing the paint into the paper. and I'm kind of moving it around with the baby wipe. And you pull it up and you get this kind of magic. Isn't that cool? I like to incorporate texture into a lot of my art, and stencils allow me to create patterned textures and things of interest that can be in the background of the piece. I find it kind of interesting to put the texture down first, keep working the piece, and the texture will reveal itself as you carry on. This is the light molding paste by Golden. It's really a nice texture. It almost looks like marshmallow fluff, doesn't it? All you do is grab your texture with a palette knife, an old hotel room key, or any kind of spreading tool. Keep the stencil on your surface and just bring it straight across. All right, I take it just to the height of the stencil. I mean, you could keep it higher, but it's not gonna, you're not gonna see the design if you do that. Let's just leave it like that just to see what happens. I haven't done that for a long time. Then when you pull this up, look at that gorgeous texture. This one comes up pretty nice too, right? Now, this is one time when I for sure go and clean my stencil, because once the texture medium dries down, it's gonna be like concrete, and I don't wanna ruin a stencil. So enjoy making texture in your work, but don't forget to clean your stencil afterwards. Have you ever used pan pastels before? Here are some of them, and it's basically a solidified pastel and works like a dream with stencils. So I have these stencils that are botanicals, and I have a piece of my painted paper here, and I'm gonna add some pan pastel detail on this. I'm just gonna use this. This is a neutral gray, and it's really a lot like using paint in that you just kind of pounce. You don't need to set it afterwards. It really grabs the surface. See how you can get a darker effect if you use a little bit more? I love this. It's also great to use these pan pastels in your journal and perhaps add some dimension and shading and so forth. So pretty. Got a little bit of airborne, but look at that. Isn't that pretty? I think I want to try. I'm curious to see if this little fern will do it here, which I think it will. Such an intricate little stencil, but I have a feeling I am swiping this sideways, mainly because the openings are so small. I think it's gonna be safe. And let's take a look. Oh, exquisite. Pan pastels, yummy. You might think about embossing powder only with respect to rubber stamps, but I'm here to tell you they work with stencils too. The embossing powders are great with stencils. You just have to remember all of our stencil do's and don'ts. The first thing is use a sponge. So I've got a stamp pad here, and I'm gonna pull up the stamp ink with my sponge, and I'm gonna just pounce down over the stencil. I'm just using a piece of painted paper because I like to do this and layer up my painted papers. Then when I'm ready to work in my journal, I have some really nice pieces of paper. I find that to be so much more fun than buying prepared papers elsewhere. Now you can't see where that is, but wait until I sprinkle the embossing powder on here. Isn't that cool? I'm gonna emboss it and show you the final result. And voila, there you have it. Embossing with a stencil. Cleaning a stencil is something I seldom do, but I've got a dirty stencil here and it's got wet paint and I've got a baby wipe, so check it out. Just lay a piece of paper underneath and wipe across with your baby wipe, with your damp rag, whatever it is you want to use. And you can get a head start on a piece of collage paper. Who knew cleaning could be so fun?